Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith Rogers. It's March 22nd, 2024, World Water Day. Ken Konka is a professor of international relations at the School of International Service at American University. He's also an expert on conflict and cooperation related to water around the world. He discusses the state of the world's water with Dr. Josh Sharfstein. Let's listen.
Professor Ken Konka, it is great to have you on Public Health on Call here to talk about World Water Day. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay. Are you adequately hydrated for this conversation?
I believe so. Thanks.
All right. Well, I want to start maybe by asking you to introduce yourself to the audience. You work a lot on water.
Yeah, so I'm a professor in the School of International Service at American University, and most of my work does, in fact, touch upon water, particularly the international and transboundary dimensions of water. You know, the thing that first got me interested in water as someone who studies international relations is that it has no respect for national borders. It flows. It won't sit still for governance, and it creates these really interesting relationships, sometimes highly conflictive, and sometimes highly cooperative. And so for someone who tries to, understand the world as a world of nations, water's really fascinating, often problematic, and it drew my attention almost from the start. I work on a lot of different international dimensions of water. So at the global level, global institutions, efforts of the United Nations, international water law, but also quite a bit on the conflict and cooperation dimensions of water as well.
So let me ask you this. This is World Water Day. What is the state of the world's water?
Well, if we start taking a human-centered view of the problem, the dominant fact is the large number of people on the planet who just don't have safe and reliable access to water. The UN estimates suggest that there's more than 2 billion people who lack a safely managed drinking water supply, which basically means a piped and enclosed system so that you're not drinking surface water or water that's very, very easily contaminated. There's almost 2 billion that don't have water on the premises. And in most of those households, women and girls are mainly responsible for water collection. So there's an important gender dynamic to this global problem of water deprivation. And it's even worse for sanitation, which in most cases is going to be a waterborne sanitation system. There are more than 3 billion people on the planet who lack safely managed sanitation systems. The Romans introduced sanitation to the Roman Empire 2 millennia ago, and we still have 3 billion people on the planet who lack access to that sort of a basic enclosed public health intervention.
How well recognized is this enormous gap? I mean, it's staggering, the numbers you said. Is this being prioritized?
So in some ways, yes, it is. When the United Nations rolled out the Sustainable Development Goals, which was a set of targets to the year 2030 to reduce various obstacles and barriers to people living healthy and fulfilled lives, water was made one of the central goals in that process. And there has been quite a bit of effort. We are seeing more resources being dedicated. The problem is it's often perceived as a question of going around the world and drilling boreholes and simply increasing access, increasing supply. When you actually get down on the ground and you look at the problem, it's often the rules governing access to water. It's often the rival and competing uses of water. It's often the way that water is priced that proves to be the primary barrier to people's access. So we often approach this with an image of scarcity that's going to be solved by enhanced supply, when really it's more of a legal and a political and administrative challenge.
Interesting. So it's not like a vaccination campaign. If we put enough resources to it alone, we can really launch it.
There certainly are elements of that. I don't want to suggest that there's an adequate flow of resources for water. The Sustainable Development Goal on water is actually to eliminate global water deprivation by 2030, which is a very ambitious goal. And we have seen an increasing mobilization of resources. Of course, COVID bit into that very, very heavily, and aspects of conflict in some parts of the world make it very, 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 very challenging as well. So there's a resource need, but there's a wider sort of enabling environment for those resources to be effective. That's also a key piece of the puzzle.
And I don't want to let this go unstated, but when a community doesn't have adequate access to water, what happens?
Well, many things happen. One thing that happens, obviously, is a sort of public health crisis because, water is so critical to public health, both directly in the sense that many of the most challenging diseases, particularly in poor communities, water is the vector of disease in some sense. So we think about cholera, we think about typhoid, think about chronic diarrhea. Water is centrally implicated there. It's also critical for livelihoods. If people have access to water as a livelihood resource, then they can supplement their income, they can enhance their life chances, they can pay their children's school fees. And so water can be a powerful pathway out of poverty if people have access. One of the problems that we see in global campaigns to alleviate water is they tend to be very stovepiped. They tend to be very segmented. So this is about water and public health over here, and this is about water and livelihoods over here. But for most people, it's really just about water. And so sometimes more integrated solutions, as is the case with many public health issues, are really the need.
And when you say livelihoods, you mean, for example, agriculture or animals or other things that people can do if they had more water to earn more money?
For sure. I mean, a tangible example. If you provide enough water for a household of 6 to 8 people to manage their daily water needs. The World Health Organization says that's about 100 liters per person per day. Well, if that household is getting that water, that's probably 15, 20% of the volume of water that they would need to supplement their income, maybe by growing vegetables and selling them in the market on the weekend or things like that, starting a laundry, something along those lines. So often what happens is really well-intentioned water aid programs come into an area and they'll build out the water supply for drinking water. And then they will come back a year later and they will find that people in that community are pooling the water resource to use it for livelihood purposes. And they're still drinking the same polluted water that they were using previously. And you sort of scratch your head and say, why is this? Well, given the pressures of income, the pressures to pay school fees for their children, the pathway out of poverty that water could be, it's not necessarily an irrational choice.
Right.
And that's an example of where we need more integrated solutions.
So interesting. Thank you. Let me ask you about your work on water in conflict, because water flows, like you said, it crosses boundaries. It can be the reason for conflict, and it can also be a weapon to be used in conflict.
For sure. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of that in the world today. I know everyone's attention is drawn to Gaza. And unfortunately, one of the things that we've seen in the current situation in Gaza is the weaponization of water, the cutoff of water supplies, the use of water to force people to move out of certain areas and to move southward, and so on. In the war in Ukraine, the Kakhovka Dam was exploded last year. The Conflict and Environment Observatory has been tracking the ramifications of that in one of the most toxic industrial regions on the planet. Something like 90 toxic industrial sites immediately in the path of the flooding, and so that has created a toxic hotspot that we'll be dealing with for years. So there's no question that water can be weaponized. It can be used as a tool in warfare, and we see that far too often. It's also the case that water directly can be a source of tension. But I think many people have a bit of an overstated view of that. There's a lot more cooperation around water, whether it's in international river basins or on the scale of local communities, than there is conflict. And it's important that, water can be used as a tool to build out some of those kind of cooperative relationships.
Well, that's very interesting. I would like on World Water Day to hear about cooperation around water. Could you give some examples?
Sure. People need water. And in most circumstances, people need to collaborate with other people to manage water supplies effectively and sustainably. And so whether it's the left bank and the right bank of the river, or whether it's upstream and downstream, even under very difficult circumstances, it is possible to use water as a tool to bring people together and try to start to build trust and build collaboration. One of the programs that we ran for several years here at American University was to bring our graduate students to the West Bank in the summer and work with local Israeli and Palestinian civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations that were trying to find ways to collaborate on water issues in a very dry land, despite the challenges of the very difficult context of conflict and occupation that we see in that space. And I'll never forget, one of the initiatives that we worked on was bringing together Israeli date farmers and Palestinian date farmers on the assumption that, number one, they had shared interests in sustainable agriculture and sustainable water supplies and solar energy and in a dry land, conserving water supplies. And that they also had some element of shared identity as farmers with a land ethic, maybe, with an environmental sensibility. And it was really, really interesting to see the farmers come together and try to collaborate, try to dialogue, try to share their experiences around date farming and to get some traction on that, even in a very, very difficult setting and context of conflict. And so I remain very optimistic that the needs around water and the ties to place around water can be a very powerful force for bringing people together, even in very difficult circumstances.
And do you see that extend to the national level? Do countries collaborate on water commonly?
Sure. So, the risk of conflict around water exists at all scales, right? So if we scale up to the transnational level, there are more than 300 transboundary rivers in the world. They either form borders between countries or they flow across borders between countries. And sometimes when they flow across borders, they create these very highly asymmetrical upstream-downstream relations that seem to be a recipe for conflict. If the upstream country takes certain actions, the downstream country suffers and so on. But the fascinating thing that we see when we study those 300 plus basins over long periods of time and we assemble data on conflict and cooperation is that the cooperative episodes far outweigh the conflictive ones. And so even in those circumstances, it is possible to come together to create institutionalized relationships, to sign a treaty, to create a dispute resolution mechanism, to start to share data, and to tap the joint gains around managing that water supply more effectively. When we do see a risk of conflict, when we do see militarized disputes start to emerge in those basins, the pattern is also fascinating. You might think it would be driven by some form of absolute water scarcity. And you'd think basins that are heavily affected by climate change or basins where water is running dry would be the basins that were most at risk of that form of conflict. But that's not at all the pattern. Instead, it's more of a stress response kind of model. When the rate of change in the basin outstrips the ability of countries to come together and manage that change, that's when you see real tensions. An interesting example is the Nile River Basin, where Egypt downstream, the most powerful country in the basin, is almost 100% dependent on the Nile for its water supplies. And now Ethiopia, up in the headwaters, has constructed one of the world's largest hydroelectric dams and has been filling the pond behind the dam, which has severe ramifications for Egypt. Egypt has threatened to use military means if necessary to keep the water flowing. And that's obviously a very volatile situation. It's gotten to the point where the UN Security Council has even got involved in the dialogue between the countries. But the real problem in that basin is that we're conducting a real-time, unprecedented experiment of building two of the largest dams in the world, the Aswan Dam that already exists in Egypt, and now the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And those dams are being operated in a completely uncoordinated manner with no cooperation institutionalized between the countries at a time when climate change is already bringing about rapid changes into the basin. So the danger there is that the countries don't have the time and the institutional mechanisms to manage the stressful change.
Got it. Sounds like there's going to be a lot of work for people in your profession.
Oh, no question. And one of the challenges is that it's highly interdisciplinary work. And so I think there's a natural tendency when we think about water to think about pumps and pipes and the role of civil engineering and the role of technical expertise. And that's certainly true.
Right. But that's not going to help resolve what's going on.
That doesn't resolve the issues, the issues that I deal with. No. And so one of the things we try to do in our graduate program is train people at the intersection of those and to be literate in multiple fields, so that when stakeholders come together around water, and law and engineering and ecology and public health are all part of the dialogue, we need people who can move across those spaces and be conversant in multiple spaces to facilitate cooperation.
I see that. Let me end with a question about climate change. You mentioned that climate change is changing water. It's obviously making some reservoirs of water dry up. How does that affect the global picture on water?
Well, the basic message of climate change, with a few exceptions, is the wet will get wetter and the dry will get drier. When we think about how the patterns of the global water cycle and water availability will occur. And so there's no one global response. And so, I live in the mid-Atlantic United States, and so do you. And that region has seen a 70% increase in rainfall. And so flooding and extreme weather episodes are becoming, unfortunately, a part of our daily life. The southwestern United States and the western United States, with wildfires and drought and so on, is a completely different sort of picture. And so the responses are going to have to be adaptive and decentralized. When you ask the question, what do you think the world of water is going to look like 30 or 40 years from now? I think the broad parameters of how we will handle water differently are pretty clear. We will be storing more water to smooth out the unevenness that climate change is going to impose upon the water cycle. We will be recycling more water. I mean, we put 6 gallons of drinking quality water into your toilet, and then you flush it away to wash away a few ounces of urine. And then we treat that water to a world-class standard, and then we simply dump it in a river. That's absurd. So we'll be recycling more water. We'll be pricing water in a way that reflects its true value much more appropriately. And we'll be redesigning our landscapes to live with floods, to live with droughts, to live with wildfires in a much more resilient manner. All of those steps are sensible. All of those steps are coming. But all of those steps are also laden with conflict. We already know the kinds of violence and conflict that we see when countries build large water storage dams. It's one of the biggest human rights challenges on the planet already, and it's only going to intensify. So there's a recipe for conflict there. When we recycle water, which makes perfect sense, you may well be denying someone downstream their access to a livelihood resource.
Right.
When we redesign our landscapes, who's got to move to make room for the flooding? And so in all of those adaptations that we must undertake and that we know are coming, we have to do it in a more conflict-sensitive manner. And so a lot of what my work these days is trying to do is to find a pathway through those adaptations that doesn't forget about equity,
right,
that doesn't forget about justice, that doesn't forget about human rights, and that therefore is sensitive to the conflict risk.
So on this World Water Day, our message is water is not just a technical challenge.
100%. And learn about water, learn about your own watershed. The adaptations that are coming, almost by definition, are going to be highly decentralized, highly localized, highly adapted to place. And so we need everyone who's going to be engaged in those conversations to have a richer understanding. And so study the water history of your place. Study the current allocation of water. I ask my students, where does the water come from? And say, well, it comes out of the tap and it goes down the drain. And sometimes that's the full extent of their knowledge.
Yeah.
We need to be better.
Ken Konka, thank you so much for this fascinating conversation.
My pleasure, Josh. Thanks for having me here.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Ciceri and Eliza Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.